Completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about the creed of the statist. Perhaps you've heard about this before. If you haven't, I'd love to introduce you to it. It's a very common attitude that we encounter, and it's not limited strictly to the left side of the political spectrum. It can be found actually across the political spectrum. A sure indicator, though, that you are dealing with a statist mindset is the absolute certainty that if something is not under the direct control or regulation or administration of the state, that somehow, by definition, it's out of control. And it's shocking how many aspects of our lives have fallen into this realm where if the state isn't administering it, people consider it out of control. Now, I know people want to be problem solvers. We see problems all around us. We want to do something. That's probably the most common thing. Well, somebody's got to do something. But it seems like we have this default setting that has a lot of people turn to the state as if, well, if there's a solution, it's going to be a political solution. Someone has got to make public policy. We'll go to a politician, hat in hand, and say, could you please solve this for us? And here's the problem with that. It brings a lot of unintended consequences. We're going to talk about a couple of different stories that illustrate this, and it tends to perpetuate the very problem that it intends to solve, simply because once the state gets involved, it has a very hard time letting go, almost as if solving that particular problem now becomes a part of reminding us why we need those who are in the act of solving it. So I want to start with a story about daycare. First round of grant funding is open to expand childcare access across Idaho. Now, I think most people would find that this is something that could be a very real problem for families. You think about this. The deadline to apply for the first round of childcare expansion grants from the Idaho Workforce Development Council is August 1st. Council Executive Director Wendy Sechrist expects the $15 million in available funding this fiscal year to quickly disappear. Now, I believe that these funds were made possible through some of the relief funds that were sent out in the course of the incredible amount of federal spending that took place during the coronavirus pandemic. So during the 2022 legislative session, the Idaho legislature approved $15 million from state fiscal recovery funds in the Federal American Rescue Plan Act to be used for child care infrastructure grants. Now, the grant funding is intended to be used to shorten wait lists for child care at high-quality facilities, including dollars that can help offset startup costs for businesses and providers who are looking to expand. After the August deadline, the program will have 2 more rounds of funding with deadlines of August 1st and January 1st. And if the $15 million isn't spent by then the council will open up another round. Now, I get it. In the grand scheme of things, how many trillions of dollars were spent as part of these federal relief efforts? And I know it seemed 15 million. Well, that's not even a drop in the bucket. That's not even pocket change comparatively. And yet, that still represents taxpayer money. Government does not make up money. It doesn't create wealth. All it can do is take it and then transfer it to other people. So that $15 million, paltry as it may seem in the grand scheme of, federal budgets and state budgets, still represents someone's effort to create value, to produce the value that is represented by that money. I only point this out because the need is great. According to a 2019 study by the Bipartisan Policy Center, Idaho has more children who need child care than available providers by about 20,000 children, or 28%. A 2020 report from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimated lack of child care costs in Idaho $479 million annually. And they're thinking in terms of absences, employee turnover. Recent statewide survey by the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry about barriers to employment cited the cost and the lack of quality childcare in Idaho as the top issue. Idaho's workforce participation rate is hovering around 62%, and Sechrist said the Idaho Department of Labor attributes at least some of that to lack of childcare, even for those who are in the workforce. Now, this is a legit problem. And for those parents who are struggling to find childcare, look, I'm not trying to rub salt in their wounds or to suggest that they're just being babies about this, but you have to understand that when you allow the state to step up and take care of things, you're creating problems in addition to ostensibly solving problems. And the bone that I have to pick with much of the legacy media is that this is almost always presented as, well, but it's a good thing, of course, especially if there are children involved. I mean, if it's for the children, why, who could possibly be against it? But it seems like we never hear a question about, well, should the state be doing this? What about the free market? Couldn't the market step in and solve things like this? I guess we're not supposed to ask that. I mean, some people use the terms capitalism and free market kind of interchangeably, and you know that there are those who are very against capitalism because they see that as simply a system in which the laws favor those with capital. But free market capitalism, in which people voluntarily make their own choices and reach out and try to meet the needs that they see within the market, that's actually a very good thing. That's a noble thing. I want to share with you 3 problems that occur whenever the state becomes our primary problem solver. The first problem is that the state requires that we delegate a portion of control over our lives to them by increasing government power in a particular area. It could be regulatory, it could be tax-wise, it could be, whatever it may be. If there's a government solution, there's going to be a corresponding growth of government power, which means our personal freedom will shrink correspondingly. Then there's the second problem. When the state becomes our primary problem solver, they have to find a way to fund their solution. Whether it's big, whether it's small, taxation is how they get their funding. The costs associated with government solutions always will come from the taxpayer's pocket. And I'm not trying to radicalize anybody by suggesting this, but when someone proposes a solution, and especially if they suggest, well, the state should step up and take care of this, sometimes it's a good habit just to ask yourself, paid for by whom? Just to remind yourself that someone at some level is going to pay for it. And even if it's apportioned out over, the whole tax-paying base, that may make it a little less painful, but it still represents somebody worked to get that money, and someone else is deciding, hey, it's in our interest to take that money and transfer it in this direction. It's not to say that there shouldn't be any taxes, but I think most reasonable people could agree that we have enough and some to spare when it comes to taxes. That is, we have too many taxes. Third problem, when the state becomes our primary problem solver, there's a tendency of every government solution to become institutionalized, meaning entrenched, and it will grow. In fact, if you've heard the term mission creep, that is perfectly describing the process by which the state assimilates larger and larger portions of our lives, because what starts as a simple solution becomes a program so good that nobody could imagine living without it. Now, there may be some things that are absolutely appropriate for the state to be involved in, and I'm not taking issue with that necessarily, but I am wondering why we don't have any deference to the free market and to the voluntary solving of problems in which people step forward and they create enough value that people would willingly choose to give their money to those businesses to get their product or their service and solve their problem. And I have a chart that I want to use to illustrate this. Now, this is, I hope you can see this clearly. These are price changes on selected U.S. goods, services, and wages, January 1997 through December 2017. So keep in mind, this is not reflecting the incredible amount of inflation that we have seen just within the last year or so. But I want you to pay close attention to those things in red, which have become more expensive, because these are the more highly regulated segments of the economy. So we're talking things like hospital services, college textbooks, college tuition. Oh, hey, what's that right in the middle? Child care, medical care services, wages, housing, food and beverages. All of those saw a very significant increase, and I'm sure that it would still continue to reflect that today. On the other hand, 1997 to 2017, look at the things that became more affordable because they were actually being addressed by the free market. This included new cars, household furnishings, clothing, cell phone service. I mean, some of us can still remember when, at least with a landline, you could call people long distance, but man, you paid through the nose, depending on the time of day. Even just from calling from one city to the next, it could cost you a lot of money. Software costs less, toys cost less, TVs have come way down in price. So the point here isn't that, government should never do anything. The point is there are some things that the free market can handle very, very well. Maybe we should give it a chance to work. Just a thought. And I just look forward to the day when there's maybe not skepticism, but at least some idea that, perhaps this is something that could be solved without turning to government and turning to the state in order to solve a problem. All right, moving on to another problem that is currently being solved as well as perpetuated by the state's involvement. Librarians prepare for continued efforts to ban books. This is an article that actually came out not quite a couple weeks ago in idahoednews.org. Last school year, for the first time in Gina Marker's 14 years as a librarian, 2 books were pulled from her shelves. Now, Marker's a librarian at Centennial Hyde. She was able to hand those books, Genderqueer, a memoir by Maya Kobabe, and This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson, to an LGBTQ teen who deeply appreciated them. But this school year, Marker won't have the same opportunities because those titles are now forbidden on campus. Now, it's interesting, and at the same time, it's not all that surprising that, the press is going to take, a very advocacy-based point of view of, well, if this is a book that applies to, LGBTQ plus teens, then by gosh, it should be there. But I also wonder why they don't ever seem to question, are there things that could be deemed inappropriate or perhaps even harmful? And I'm not saying that those books necessarily are harmful, but I can certainly understand why some people would have an issue with those being not only readily available, but promoted perhaps, because this seems to be promoting, at least in the way that this article is written. Marker led a panel discussion on book challenges, censorship, and also serving at the library, or students rather, Wednesday, this was a couple weeks ago again, at the Idaho Commission for Library Summer Summit Conference. Now, that conversation was timely following a legislative session where types of books on library shelves became a flashpoint. Now, the Library Commission budget was threatened due to controversy over whether Idaho kids could access what some lawmakers deemed obscene reading materials. The budget bill eventually passed, and legislators introduced a bill which did not become law that would see librarians, teachers, and museum staff members fined and or jailed if they disseminated material harmful to minors. Now, there's 2 things that I find curious about this mentioning of it. Okay, it didn't become law, but it's still worth mentioning. But I have to ask, is there anything at this point that could be deemed material harmful to minors? I mean, I'm thinking back to an old Dragnet episode where, Sergeant Friday was going after some guy who was distributing smut to the kids. And boy, he was really dressing him down. We have standards in this community and we don't want to have that kind of thing going on. And I know that's a caricature to some people, but the truth of the matter is there are people who are concerned. They don't want to see things given to kids that will burden them with issues that they're just not emotionally or mentally ready to carry themselves. And that's not being patronizing to kids. That's doing what adults are supposed to do. Kids are not given the full right to choose everything in their lives until they reach an age, 18, I believe, is the age where you can actually contract for yourself, 21 for other things like smoking and drinking and so forth. Why do we pretend that things involving sexuality are somehow, easily grasped and easily manageable by kids? And I'm just asking the question, is there such a thing as harmful material? And where would most people draw that line? Now, they talk about how the legislators are banning books, sometimes in large numbers, or Idaho districts rather, banning books, with the Nampa School District making a controversial decision. I have to ask, controversial to whom? Are we being steered towards a conclusion here? Was it controversial to people who want to promote those books to children, or was it controversial to parents who are like, oh, thank goodness, I don't really want my kid being subjected to indoctrination into values that are not consistent with what I'm trying to raise them to embrace. So they made the decision to pull 22 books from their shelves this year. Wednesday's panel, again, this was a week or more ago, aimed to foster conversation about how to navigate the increasing calls for censorship in libraries. Now, I'm going to quibble over that word censorship because I think there is such a thing as appropriateness, age appropriateness. And even the people who are some of the most staunch defenders of reading and of getting kids involved in books would say that it's not a matter of we need to keep kids away from these ideas, but rather we need to make sure that we're not throwing things at them before an appropriate age. And that may vary from district to district. It may vary from parent to parent. But Marker says, it's easy to feel personal despair in the wake of these book challenges. I was seen as a peddler of pornography by providing access to these books. Now, granted, not every book is going to be an example of pornography, but some of them are extremely graphic. And it's not just, hysterical people clutching their chests and having a case of the vapors who would see them as pornographic. Reasonable people could take exception to their kids being shown this kind of material. Then we read about how building relationships helps to dispel distrust and invite conversation. And this is actually a pretty positive part of this article here. Natasha Rush, a teacher librarian at Boise High School, said that she does whatever she can to get out in the community and to build relationships, whether that means keeping score at basketball games, subbing for classes, or participating in games at assemblies. Being part of the community makes civil, in-person conversations more likely if a parent becomes uncomfortable with a book, she said. Now, this school year, a parent approached her with concerns about a book called We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson. Rush discussed options with the parent, saying they could start the formal book challenge process and procedure, or she could make an electronic note so that the parent's child would be unable to check out the book. That way, she told the parent, you can make the parenting decision for your child and not another. Now, the parent hadn't realized that that was an option and decided to add the note instead of seeking permanent removal of the title. I actually think that is a pretty workable solution. And I'll grant you, not everybody's going to agree with me on this, but it's not so much a matter of, well, I want to parent everybody else's kids and I want to make sure that, they're doing exactly what they should and reading things that only I would approve of. But parents should definitely have the ability to nix exposure to certain books or certain topics if they feel like that's just not appropriate for my kid or that's contrary to the values that I'm trying to raise my child with. This is one of the dangers that I see in some of the more activist teachers out there, the ones who are, more eager to talk about their pronouns and talk about their love life with their students than to simply teach them the things that they're supposed to be learning at school. I know they talk about it as if, well, it puts me in some kind of a prison. If I'm not free to discuss what I and my partner were doing over the weekend, then somehow you're putting me in chains. But I that sounds pretty narcissistic to me. I think their first focus should be on teaching the kids and not so much on, trying to normalize things that are, for whatever reason, important to that teacher. And especially when it comes to, telling these kids, you're safe with me. If you want to change your identity or you want to change your gender or you want to go by different pronouns than you do around your parents, well, your secret is safe with me. That seems like really suspicious behavior in that it seeks to undermine the child-parent relationship. And I don't agree with the idea that, any parent that wouldn't accept their child's, wanting to change their pronouns is, inherently abusive. Kids sometimes get confused. Parents have the primary responsibility to see them through and to help them. And they may have teachers, they may have mentors, they may have counselors that can help them too, but it's the parent's primary responsibility. Anybody who undermines that, I think, is treading on some very, very thin ice. One more thought here. Kristen Kerr, teacher librarian at Coeur d'Alene High School, says it's imperative for libraries to have a wide array of reading materials available for students. She says by giving choices, students can find something they relate to. Students want to see themselves in what they read and know that they're not alone, even if they feel alone in their schools. So in her library, she hopes that all 1,600 of the school's students can find a book that reflects them, whether in regards to race, sexual identity, home life, mental health, homelessness, trauma, or any other aspect of their lived experiences. I don't know why, but that comes off as very heavy on social justice lingo. And granted, I mean, kids definitely have issues. I think back to when I was in school and there were kids who I'm sure were dealing with some serious issues. It could be alcoholic parents. It could be, unemployment. It could be abusive siblings. It could be a number of things. But these things about the obsession with race and sexual identity, mental health and homelessness and trauma and lived experience, those seem like the words of the social justice intersectionality kind of lexicon. And so maybe I'm the only one who's suspicious about this, but I have to question, is this really about helping the kids learn? Is it really about helping? And for that matter, do we really want to make our schools the place where we outsource all of this to help kids through all of those things? It seems like it's asking a lot of educators. I mean, if they're going to be, counselors and helping them navigate questions of race, or helping them deal with questions of sexual identity, mental health, homelessness, trauma, that's putting a pretty big burden on the teachers. And I wonder if how long before we just go ahead and let's just have somebody from the school come and tuck them into bed, because, that's what we're here for. We're here to just make things happen. Now, I get it. Not everybody's going to agree with this, and maybe that seems like a very radical or extremist point of view to assert that some things are inappropriate for the classroom. But my thinking on this is, in the classroom, you're dealing with a captive audience in the sense that schools are compulsory. And I'm not trying to say this, to sensationalize it. I mean, virtually every state has compulsory public school laws. You send your kids to school, or there's going to be a problem with truancy. And that's the kind of problem that will bring legal consequences, including arrest and jail and charges. And, it's been this way for quite some time. The public school system was actually sold to the states on the idea that this is such a good idea, we need to make it compulsory. And I think a lot of good can happen there. But when you have a captive audience like this, I also think it's very tempting for some people to take advantage of this and try to inculcate attitudes, which they deem correct attitudes, that will hopefully take hold and then thread their way throughout society. I believe a lot of the social justice stuff that we're seeing is an excellent example of this. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be an extremist. This is much easier than you think. In fact, this will illustrate. The easiest way to be extreme today is just to do whatever was normal 50 years ago. And I'm not exaggerating. It's really that easy. There was an excellent article in actionidaho.org, which addresses this recent, there's almost a hysteria, like War of the Worlds type hysteria that's been developing among Idaho's legacy media about extremism in Idaho. Oh my goodness, the Idaho Statesman did a 2-part series, and I'm surprised that they didn't have to have oxygen administered, because there is so much hyperventilating in the article that you can imagine that somebody had to be there, waving them, maybe giving them smelling salts, just so they could go on with what they were talking about. And the question that I have for you, and this is thanks to the actionidaho.org folks and their wonderful article, there are extremists in Idaho, just not who you think. I want to pose a couple of questions and ask you, is it really radical to question the following things? Because I'm not so sure that a person who questions these kind of things is really that much of an extremist. I think they're actually a pretty normal person who's just saying, is this right? For instance, a person who questions celebrating men dressed as sexualized women, grooming children at LGBTQ plus pride parades. Is that really an extremist thing? Because it wasn't so long ago, that's something a very normal person would do. Now, granted, some people see no problem with it, but there are an awful lot of people, and they're not hateful white supremacists, who would just say that's not appropriate. How about this? Is it really radical to question condemning any person who dissents from the coronavirus lockdowns? How about questioning treating concerns about anti-white critical race theory as a witch hunt? I mean, come on, if you're going to teach kids, hey, you're a bad person because of the color of your skin and there's nothing you can do about it, that sounds like a very racist attitude. But that's exactly what critical race theory tries to teach children who have white skin. Tolerating vaccine mandates on employees. Is it radical to question that? Especially when you're denying someone their bodily autonomy, threatening their livelihood if they refuse to submit to a medical procedure that they really don't want? Is it wrong to question that God-denying philosophies should inform every aspect of our public life? Is it really radical to question encouraging young children to transition from one gender to another? I mean, I know these are probably the exception, but when you see people on TikTok, and I've seen a couple of videos just within the last couple of days of mothers who are saying, I knew that my son was ready to start transitioning when he was 2 or 3 years old because he said, Mom, I want to be a girl. I have to question, is it really the kid who's making those decisions, or is it somebody else? Is it wrong to question the encouragement of internet mobs and cancellations? Because there seems to be plenty of that to go around. But wait, there's more. Is it really radical to question the enactment of a 2-tiered justice system, forgiving leftist crime while inflating rightist crime? Good example of this, Alec Baldwin, Jussie Smollett, Hunter Biden, they're walking around as free men today. In the meantime, grandmothers who walked through the Capitol taking pictures on January 6th are sitting in federal prison right now because they are deemed to have been so bad and so criminal in their behavior that they were too dangerous to leave in society. Something about that just doesn't seem proportionate. Is it wrong to question bringing tens of millions of immigrants and refugees into the country, often secretly, and then surreptitiously planting them in communities, busing them here and there, and presumably to help bolster the voting rolls? Is it wrong to question celebrating declines in domestic energy production? How's that working out for us? Is it radical to question refusing to cover attacks on churches and pregnancy centers since Roe was overturned? How about, is it really radical to question calling riots peaceful protests? And I really love how actionidaho.org summed this up. They said the leftist establishment openly hates the country as systematically racist, sexist, homophobic, unequal, polluters, etc. That message comes through loud and clear, by the way, in many of these activists as well as many of their supporters within the media. But actionidaho.org points out, then these same activists and media sources had the gall to label those who oppose them extremists. See, I don't think it's an extremist thing to oppose these sorts of things. I think it's actually what a very normal person would do, particularly a person who wants to be left alone, a person who doesn't want to be, dictated to. You have to think this. You have to feel this way. You have to do everything I say because I'm a victim, and you therefore have to feel bad, and I have control over you. And that seems to be how a lot of the social justice warriors approach life. Look, I think life is tough, and I think some people, have a tough time dealing with whatever hand was dealt them. I can only speak for myself. I don't want to make anybody's life more difficult than it already is, but I also don't want to be a doormat for somebody else to, stand on and kick around and wipe their shoes on and demand things of. And I especially take exception to the idea that people who would object to some of these very radical positions, at least to my thinking, the ones I outlined to you here, they seem very radical to me. It seems odd that you would be deemed an extremist simply for disagreeing with them. Is it not possible for people to have differing points of view? Is that not the epitome of tolerance? Because it seems like there are people who, for whatever reason, will not be content until everybody agrees with them perfectly on every question. And if you don't, well, they're ready to damn you to hell for disagreeing. I particularly see this animus directed towards people in what I would term the independent media. And it was interesting when Idaho Freedom Foundation President Wayne Hoffman had Greg Pruitt and myself on his program last week. Greg Pruitt is doing a marvelous job in being an independent news outlet. He's not a trained journalist, but he's someone who cares about the truth and is just trying to get it out there to the best of his ability. Here's the key difference. He expects people to make up their own minds about what they're reading, about what the information that they're consuming. That seems very reasonable to me. There's no heavy-handed, you better believe this or you're a bad person. But to hear the critics who were so upset, and in particular, there were some members of the Idaho Press Club who really took exception to that discussion of how the legacy media in Idaho has taken a hard turn to the left, and they feel like that it cannot be legitimate. And I wanted to share with you, in fact, I'm going to end on this quote from Glenn Greenwald, who I consider one of the very few people out there who really deserves the moniker of journalist. On paper, there's no way that Glenn and I should line up. He seems to come from a left-wing sort of background, but I would never know it by the way that he reports the news, because this is a guy who just states the facts and lets people make up their minds. And it's one of the reasons why I think he is actually one of the more trusted voices out there. Glenn Greenwald says, liberals never accuse people who work for major media corporations such as CNN, NBC, the New York Times, or Washington Post of being grifters. That's a term reserved exclusively for independent journalists, because liberals are authoritarians who think legitimacy requires corporate control and approval. So if someone is suggesting that you can't think that because that falls outside the boundaries of approved opinion, or they think there needs to be some kind of corporate control or approval, maybe you should do a better job or choose more wisely when it comes to your media sources. Bottom line is, Either you will make up your mind about what kind of information you will consider, or someone else will do it for you. There really is no middle ground. It's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. I trust you to make the right decisions, even if you disagree. That's okay. See, in my world, my belief system doesn't require that you have to agree with me in order for me to go through life and be happy and content. And I'm hoping that you feel the same way. But for those people who have a little bit more stringent idea of, what is acceptable and what isn't, and everybody who doesn't agree with me is somehow extremist or suspect, well, I hope they get the help that they need. But I certainly don't want to play their game. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.